Hi guys, it's Jamie here, and for this week's colour palette challenge we're working with quite a limited palette of mostly greens, a slight silvery grey and a beige colour. So I have decided to use one of the second-hand canvases that I pick up for 50p to £1, which is under $1 for the challenge. I gave you the colours based on a photograph I took out on an early morning dog walk around my local lakes. And I've decided this week I want to try some impasto with my acrylics. I'm actually going to use the photograph as the base for my canvas. At the moment you can see me just painting over the canvas with the white gesso, including the sides. This is to knock back the original print that's on the canvas. Because I want to do something impressionistic, I'm now using some Mod Podge and one layer of a paper napkin to create some texture on this primed canvas. I actually want to create some wrinkles when adding this paper napkin. And as you can see on the video, I'm actually going to wrap the napkin around the box sides of the canvas as well. And now the canvas has been fully wrapped, I'm adding a thin coat of Mod Podge to make sure that everything is sealed. I don't particularly like white looking canvases, so here I have a cold grey acrylic paint that I'm going to cover the canvas in to give me a colour base to start the painting with. Now my distressed grey base is dry, I'm going to mix together the cold grey and the white acrylic, and using my palette knife add some thick layers for the sky and the lake aspect of the photograph that you can see at the top left hand corner of the screen. Once that's dried off, I decide that really I do need to sketch some basic shapes in just so I get some form of composition and divide my canvas according to the thirds that I can see on the photograph. Here I'm just using my Derwent Ink Intense pencil in the colour bark. It's actually quite blunt. This is not needed to be that accurate. It's just a guideline for me when I add more paint. My colour choices here are Payne's Grey, Burnt Sienna and the cold grey that's already been used. I start with using the palette knife to add dark tones to the canvas. However, I'm soon unhappy with how thickly that's going on and switch to a wine bottle cork. Basically, I'm just experimenting with different ways to get the paint and the shade onto the canvas. Again, I'm not hugely happy, so I'm now trying the smoothing tool with that colour on it. Therefore, I think you can see that all of these tutorials and exercises that I'm presenting to you are more about me just practicing and trying different techniques until I find something that works for me. And I encourage you to do the same. Don't shy away from an exercise, give it a go, try lots of different materials, tools and ideas, and keep going until you are either happy with the result or you decide that particular method isn't for you. What you can't see on this particular piece of video is that I am constantly looking at the original photograph and trying to get the areas of shade onto the canvas that are in roughly the same positions as that photo, but obviously using our limited palette, which I'm mixing together to make the most of the limited colour palette. Having a limited colour palette can be quite challenging in trying to achieve a wide range of colour variation on this canvas. It can make it a bit more difficult to create contrast, depth or even visual interest, which is why I'm busy mixing away. The coolness in the tones of this palette does mean that we're looking at maybe a more serene expression of emotion rather than anything passionate or vibrant. Again, you may find trying to impart a sense of tranquility in whatever you decide to do with the colour palette more of a challenge than last week. Now I've switched to a favourite of mine, an old thin plastic store card. I find this just gives me the flexibility to be able to make more precise marks in places that I want them. Remembering I'm going for an impasto thick application of the paint anyway. That's why personally I'm avoiding brushes at this stage. Here I'm using the raw sienna to add some highlight areas, and again I'm mixing it into what's already on my palette to extend the colour range that I'm working with. I'm trying to get the impression of the trees at the other side of the lake and avoid creating a monotonous visual experience because of the lack of the broad range of colours available. Therefore, even though I'm working on what is a distance view, I am trying to keep it engaging in composition and colour and drawing the eye in. I am aware even at this stage that it might cause me some difficulty in creating focal points, given the whole scene is trees and leaves in summertime and the limited palettes available, and yet I want some focal points to grab attention, guide the viewer in, make it an interesting canvas. I think in some ways I have made my life a little bit easier in trying to recreate the photograph in a painterly manner onto a canvas, because obviously depending on the subject you choose, you may find that those colours are not what you're looking for, particularly if you're going for realism. Having said a lot about the limitations of this particular colour palette and why it's so challenging, it is important to understand that having a limited palette actually can spark creativity and encourage problem solving. It does offer opportunities for exploring harmony, subtlety, unity in the artwork. However, when you see my final piece, you'll realise it's not really subtle, and maybe a little bit unified. I do really try to embrace the constraints of replicating a photograph, the limited colour palette, to get something with using different techniques and layering and textures that adds interest to the canvas and makes it a more compelling piece of art than a straightforward landscape. It's one reason why I chose to do an impasto technique, because I wanted to add some depth and some textures, build up the layers of paint so that I could add some depth and dimension to the canvas. By thickly applying the paint, I'm trying to create a sense of presence and make it more visually engaging. Also, when you're using an impasto technique, it does allow for brushwork and mark making, which can add a sense of energy and expression. Because of the thickness of the paint, impasto takes a while to dry. I stepped away from the canvas for a couple of hours before coming back and starting to tackle the foreground using very similar colour palette and technique that I'd used before, with the palette knife being the first application. To start to block in the trees, I went back to using the plastic card and a thin edge of the card, and just made lots of marks that could represent branches and tree trunks, while having a raised texture by using the impasto, and also don't forget the napkin at the very beginning, can interact with light in quite creative and interesting ways. The peaks and the ridges of the paint can actually catch the light and create highlights and cast shadows. I didn't want to rely purely on textures and depth of the paint to do that for me, and mixed some highlight paint in, and again added that with my trusty plastic card. I also try adding some lines to represent branches using the edge of the palette knife and alternate it with the plastic card. Here you see me playing, and this is often what I do. I'm not happy with how bright that particular tree trunk got, so I'm now adding some of the dark using the palette knife edge and add in even more branches. So as you can tell, I kind of just keep playing until I get to something that vaguely looks like what I was imagining in my mind's eye. Something I particularly like about oil paints over acrylics is the fact they take so much longer to dry, and that gives me more of an opportunity to keep adding paints, changing shades whilst the paint is still wet, and you get a much more, to me, blended look. While I am aware that you can buy products to delay the drying time of acrylics and get a similar result as you would oils, I also have to keep in mind that I'm making tutorials, and therefore I do need things to dry so I can keep adding extra layers and dimension and whatever I'm deciding to do with a canvas that needs it dry in as short amount of time as possible. Otherwise, I'd have to make these tutorials over 3 to 4 weeks. The other reason I don't use oils anymore, apart from the drying time, is the expense of oils in the UK. The last time I worked with oils, I was in Shanghai in 2008, and they were so cheap out there, £1 a huge tube. So obviously you could use them quite freely. Here I decided to try and block out the foreground even more and create some movement to the ground by taking the strokes of the plastic in different directions. I noticed that we've lost the bench leg, so I add that back in and then take the excess to create more shade, and again smooth that out a bit. Having let everything dry, I'm now coming in with a bit of bathroom sponge with similar colours and sponging in an impression of leaves and foliage. And finally, I have a paintbrush, and this is because bits of the grey at the bottom of the canvas are still showing through where the canvas has the texture, and the paintbrush allows me to get into those dips. Having lost some of the darkness, I'm now using a paintbrush with a darker tone to bring that back. I also take down some of the colour reflections in the lake using the bluey grey colour on the brush. And now I'm trying to make in some detail of the grasses at the edge of the lake. Having left the canvas overnight to dry, I'm back the next morning with a rigger or liner brush and some colours, and I'm just trying to add some real wispy lines that are very, very thin to the canvas. Remembering that I want something very abstract, and at the moment this still isn't really what I was looking for in terms of canvas. It's still too traditional looking. I don't really overcome the traditionalness of this canvas because I continue to use the very fine paintbrush to add leaf detail and more white or light grey highlights to represent sunlight. I actually keep working away with the little brush for quite a bit of time, and I think that's because I'm wondering whether I could do a more traditional style landscape painting. I didn't want a traditional looking impressionist painting, so here I'm using a black Sharpie to make geometric shapes, mostly squares and rectangles, around the different shading that's already been created using the acrylic paints. I suppose this is a bit of a throwback to the neurographic art project we did, where we did a background and then created a neurographic using the shades and tones of the background to decide how we were going to make the neurographic art. I am aware that this colour palette challenge is already quite long, so rather than you sit through me drawing lots of lines and lots of shapes, I'm going to come back when I filled most of that in. Having added all my oblongs and squares, a few dots and some circles for the leaves, I'm now using some normal brush markers to colour in my shapes. However, I very quickly decide I don't particularly like that effect and move on to using metallic markers. I do love the vibrancy of that effect, and I'm just showing you some of the markers that I used and the different brands, mostly from Amazon, and they're not particularly well known, but they got reasonable reviews, 4 or 5 star, and cheaper than regular brands that you may have heard of. I thought I had finished, however, I decided that as it was beginning to look a bit like Gustav Klimt, I might as well go full on and add more shapes and more colour, glitter, even gold leaf. So while Klimt actually used more intricate and decorative patterns in his paintings and mine are much, much simpler, I have stuck with the idea of the geometric patterns. And with the lake, you'll notice that I'm going purely horizontally across the lake to give it a sense of movement, which is what Klimt tried to do with his swirls, florals, intricate shapes and motifs. It's a nod to Klimt because he actually used symbolism and allegory. Often his works contain symbolic elements within them, which he used in a time slightly more restrictive to explore deeper meanings behind love and sexuality. The symbolic elements were often depicted through the use of stylized figures and objects, and of course, with this being a landscape, I haven't really added that to it. However, he was a keen user of impasto and built up layers of paint and glazes to create, again, a richness and complexity to his artwork. Whereas the elements I'm adding now to this painting are actually making it look simpler rather than more complex. When you first look at this, if you hadn't seen the tutorial, it wouldn't look like all that underpainting in the acrylics and the impasto had even taken place. Apart from the use of metallics and particularly gold leaf, Klimt was also known for bold and contrasting colours and vibrant hues such as the reds, the blues, the golds, trying to create a striking effect. And it was often by the juxtapositioning of the contrasting colours that added the energy and the intensity to his paintings. Most of the Klimt paintings that I've seen have been portraiture, and here we have a landscape, and it was known for being quite detailed portraiture, always trying to capture the unique features and expressions of his subjects, the most famous portrait being The Kiss, and his portraits often included elaborate costumes and accessories which allowed him to enhance the ornamental quality and richness within his art. To become more Klimt-like, I'm adding little areas of faux gold leaf over both the trees, which will hopefully attract the eye of the viewer because at the moment it's still a little dominated by the foreground. Though I will know better when the glue is dried and a dry brush has been run over the gold leaf. Perhaps I need to do something about the bench, not quite sure yet. I've cleaned off any excess of the gold foil. Unfortunately, it's not showing up that well in the video camera. I'm just quickly showing you that the sides have been painted with a mixture of the green and the dark brown. The last finishing touch I want to do is to add some spray and shine over the surface and the sides. I'm using the shine rather than the matte because of the metallic pens and also the gold foiling. This is being done in a room with the window wide open, or you can wear a face mask to protect yourself. I'm hoping with these close-ups that you can see the detail in the paintings, particularly the gold leaf, which is very Klimt. I still haven't made a decision about that bench, but I did add a few stripes to it. Anyway, I did finally get to a result I'm happy with, even if it did divert a little off the original colour palette. I hope you enjoyed this slightly longer tutorial, and I will catch up with you very, very soon.